Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about history, a little bit of my history. I have been very, very fortunate in my life to interview and talk and chat with people of all different professions, all different walks of life, all different philosophies, since I was a little kid. I made it a point when I was a kid that I wanted to interview people and talk to them and learn about them. And it was a wonderful thing for me because, in a sense, when I was very young, due to circumstances in my family, we were moving about every 6 months. And so the early days of my life was going to a new place, a new school, starting classes, and then moving, and then doing the process over and over and over and over again, many, many times. This made education kind of difficult. It was not easy. And also, I didn't ever get a base of friends because I didn't grow up with any group. I would make friends, and as soon as I made the friends, they were gone because I was gone. And so I kind of backed away from trying to get myself involved with too many people and decided I would start really studying a lot of history. And I really focused. I read constantly and also made it a point to talk to people. And I found, as a kid, I found people, World War I veterans. And I talked to people who were around in the 1890s and 1880s and to learn what it was like. And an old lady told me the first time she heard an airplane fly over, she said it scared the living hell out of her because it didn't make any sense. And, this loud thing flying up in the air, she didn't know what it was. And I talked to a lady in 1968, long, long time ago. Her name was Miss Holmes. And it's 12 o'clock, just so you know. The old French clock is keeping very good time. But I talked to Miss Holmes, and Miss Holmes had worked in Washington, D.C. during the Taft administration. And she had lived in Washington, D.C. for much of her early life. And so she had seen some of the old presidents. Like she remembered Grover Cleveland. And she remembered William McKinley. And she remembered Theodore Roosevelt, although she wasn't fond of Theodore Roosevelt. It's interesting. And she worked in the Taft administration. That might be the reason why she didn't like Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know. And she said there was always jokes about Taft, because Taft was always making jokes about his size anyway. And she said that the old joke in Washington, D.C. was that President Taft would gladly give up his seat in a streetcar for three ladies waiting to get a seat. So, but I talked to an aviator from World War I, which was an amazing thing. I've talked to presidents, I've talked to senators and actors and newsmen and singers and you name it. It's been my pleasure to sit and chat with people, and got to talk with lots of newsmen, sitting there and chatting actually with Mike Wallace in his kitchen at his house. We sat there and just chit-chatted, and it was a wonderful conversation. And just sitting down and chatting with Yogi Berra and and talking to him about his career, and chatting, with Bob Dole, who's just recently passed away. And he told me about when he was going to school, how he was very, very intent on getting really good grades. And so he had a recorder that he would put up in the front of the classroom, which was a wire type recorder. And he could capture the lesson for the class, and then he would listen to it at night to double check his work. Talking to the newscasters, talking to astronauts, talking to various actors. I remember sitting with Celeste Holm, and we were sitting there chatting and talking about her career and all the people she, knew and hung out with and who she started with. And we were talking about one of her first times on stage was with George M. Cohen. And I remember talking to George M. Cohen's daughter, and learned a lot from her. And, Joe Smith from the Avon Comedy 4, or better known as Smith and Dale, sitting there chatting with him. And his career started in the 1890s. He was a kid. And just to sit and talk to these fellas, when he was talking about that kid, what was his name? George Burns? So it was fun. And listening to what, great newscasters had to say, sitting there talking to Walter Cronkite about, the news, the Kennedy assassination, the moon landings, and simpler things like talking about his childhood, how he had his grandparents had Edison phonographs, and his parents had Victor phonographs. They were a little bit more modern, but he said no matter where I was, I had to wind them. And so it's kind of an interesting perspective. And all of this phenomenal information, all of these fantastic conversations have shaped me in many respects, and have affected me in many respects as to how I look at things, how I digest things, how I look at history, how I look at events that took place in the world. I can remember what many of the people said. I remember sitting there talking to a young man, an old man who, as a young man, was sitting next to Adolf Hitler. And he said, in a funny way, he said, I thought he was kind of interesting, but obviously he didn't like me because I was Jewish. And so that was the end of that. But he had escaped from Germany in 1936. But talking to so many other people who had a place in history, or were just everyday people who were experiencing the world of their time. And so I'm talking about me in that regard. That's what has always made me who I am to a degree. I'm a little bit of everyone. I've taken little parts and added these little pieces to become part of my personality, my knowledge, my understanding. That's who I am. I just figured I've never really sat down and said all of this. And as I've mentioned, my childhood was pretty rotten, and went through some really bad times. As I said, we constantly had to move. And that led to some hard times, education-wise, because you would start in a school, and as soon as you got yourself set, you go to another school, maybe in another state, where the level was different. And that caused issues as well. But the one thing I always focused on, the one thing I always stuck with, was talking to people, learning from people, and creating an archive in my mind, which was important because I didn't have the friends, as I have mentioned, from my childhood. And so, in a sense, historical figures, people who were involved with history, people who saw history, became my friends. And that's very important. One last thing to mention. I was fortunate enough to get Theodore Edison's phone number. He's the youngest son of Thomas Edison. A friend of mine gave me that. And I called and we just sat down and started chatting. And I learned so much from Theodore Edison. And I talked to him several times and we had some interesting conversations. And he was amazingly brilliant. He was in awe of his father. I mean, having a father like Thomas Edison must have been a very difficult thing if you think about it. Having a father that is famous is always going to be a difficult thing for a child. You think of Thomas Edison Jr., what an awful name to get stuck with. Because everything he did was under a microscope. And so he had an inventive bent, but he was a little crazy, to a degree like his father. But every time he did something, his father would say, "You're using my name." That was quite an interesting situation. And I talked to Enrico Caruso's son. He was living in Florida at the time, and talking to George M. Cohen's daughter, and talking to many people who performed in vaudeville and people who made recordings, talking to them. As Joe Smith used to say, we sang in the tube. and that was fascinating to touch that history, to sit down and, run into great performers and just talk to them for a moment and learn from them, get a little touch of them. Always keep a picture of Frank Sinatra because, getting to talk to him as well was kind of fascinating. And talking to Mickey Rooney and talking to June Lockhart and so many other people who, were very much involved in the entertainment field. I guess I could go on forever and I should stop because I've said enough. But in closing to this rambling, if you get the opportunity, especially if you're a kid, try to find people, talk to them, learn from them, and make what they have learned part of your education. And take that knowledge, use it, and remember it. And then when you study events, when you study pieces of history, especially stuff within like the last 100 years, you can take the memories of what those people told you and use that as somewhat of a filter as you look at a stark, cold history of an event that took place so many years ago. So that's kind of like me. I am a Whitman sampler. I use that term a lot. I am a Whitman sampler of various fields of information, and very happy to be so. I am not a genius in any of them, or I should say I'm a jack of all trades and a master at none. But history is my love. Music is my love. And the history of entertainment, the history of the American presidency, the history of various technologies is always a fascinating thing for me. And that's about it. So thank you so much.